So we're going to be looking at, does the fund sector value diversity? And I almost want to give the other side of the coin of that. Does the fund sector understand the dangers of the status quo? But this is going to be a very fun panel. We're going to have lots of stories. And I'm just asking you, for my own vanity, to talk amongst yourselves while I get myself into this chair. Wonderful. So we have a wonderful fireside chat with us today. So we have Mitesh, Chief Investment Officer.
Mitesh,
Sheth, sorry.
That's all right.
It's been a very long day.
I've said it more often than you've had to say it.
Thank you very much. Chief Investment Officer for Multi-Asset Newton Investment Management. And Tarr, who is Portfolio Manager at Kavedon Capital. Thank you, both of you. So I know you have lots and lots of stories. I'm thinking it's going to be a very easy half hour for me. I can just sit back. So I wanted to start off with a conversation, getting a bit of background from both of you on why is diversity and inclusion important to the industry, but more importantly, what is important to you? So Carol, I'll start off with you.
Diversity and inclusion in the fund industry. It's important because there's really basically money being left on the table. I mean, if everyone's chasing after the same people that they met, 40 years ago in the dorm at Harvard, then they're missing so many more people that they don't know. And, it's important to have different and diverse investors who then have their networks and then can have access to that deal flow, because these are people you've never met before. And so it's important, just open up your doors, open up your world.
Mitesh, what about you?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think growing up in a relatively kind of poor neighborhood and family, going through a state school, not knowing anyone who worked in the city or in financial services, and as I kind of made my way through the industry, I was just surprised by how few people there were that I had grown up with or that I spent time with outside of work, even today, who work in this industry or are leading this industry. And a lot of the charities that I work with or groups I with, that they just don't know. They see these tall, shiny buildings and don't know anyone who works there. And I think it's such a shame, because the grit, the resilience, the talent, the hunger, the ambition that I see in so many of these people, not just young people, but of all ages, we're completely missing out on by not being able to broaden our lens. So it's really important to me. And the second thing I'd say is, it's not just DE&I, but people are important. And people come in lots of different flavors. And just having vanilla every time you go to the ice cream store seems a real shame.
Poor vanilla. You can put toppings on it. It's interesting. I loved how you said, don't just pay attention to the people you went to Harvard with. I think it's, there are a lot of I work with a lot of startups. Sometimes if you look around your board and everyone went to the same school and the same type of place, it's to me, that's a risk management red flag. But Mitesh, I wanted to talk with you because we had, of course, everyone knows we do prep calls before this. You called one of your former teams a team of misfits. What does that mean?
So I'd say for most of my career, I felt like a misfit, like a fish out of water. The number of times I was described as a rough diamond. If we could just polish off those rough edges, you would do so much better, was the feedback I got most often. And really, it was trying to take a square peg and shove it into a round hole. And I think for much of my career, I really just accepted it. It's only really in the last few years, and it's when I came across this kind of startup-led challenger brand, Reddington, and I had the chance to lead it as its CEO. And I looked around and I went, the reason I feel such belonging here is because this is a team of misfits. These are all the square pegs that didn't quite fit in most of the other round holes, and decided that they weren't just going to shave off all the best bits of themselves so that they didn't make their colleagues feel uncomfortable. And they wanted to be in a place where they could bring all of their talents and skills and passions to work. And an employer and an environment that really recognized that that's what it was there to do. So yeah, I often described it as a team of misfits, because it was really the first time in my career, maybe 20 years since working, where I felt like I really belonged. And that's really massive, because I felt that for the bulk of my career, I was hiding most of the parts of me that I considered as my identity.
I've just, when you told me that, I felt so horrible for you, this idea that you were told to shave off bits of you. I found that really disturbing. But I mean, maybe I'll talk to you, Carol. Have you ever felt like a misfit? Do you want to be on that team?
I'm a proud misfit. Because who can spend their time, who goes to work to deal with, these very restricted, defined walls and borders and organizational culture? You're there to do a job, right? So is it about having the same lunchbox as everyone else has? It's a huge thing in the Netherlands. I've noticed is that people are very interested in what you have for lunch, because the whole team sits together at lunch, and you dare not go anywhere else. And there's always this discussion of what's that? And so should I have my lunchbox conform to everyone else's lunchbox? No, I like my lunch. And if my lunch doesn't fit in, of course this is a point going to an analogy because it's not all about lunch. But
no, I like food analogies. It's right, it works. Everyone understands them.
That's right, though. But in terms of also, like I said, deal flow, I know different people who don't necessarily fit into what they see normally, and different kinds of people. So my tribe is misfits. That's who we are, and we come up with new ideas, and we're working on solving problems from a new perspective that does not fit in to the way that it has always been done and hasn't solved all the problems doing it that way.
So, I mean, a lot of this, what we're going to discuss is looking at sort of strategies, because I think there are a lot of well-meaning people in this industry, that want a more diverse, customer base and employee base, but they sort of don't quite know how to go about it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about company culture. And Mitesh, I'll start with you only because you told that, rough diamond story. In terms of a company culture, where does that kind of ownership lie? Should we say, actually, it's the responsibility of the employee to come in and fit into that culture? Or what can a company do to make sure everyone's got a different lunchbox and everyone can talk about it and see what's going on? Like, where does the ownership lie?
Yes, I love that we've moved on to talk about culture, because I feel like we can get so bogged down in the box ticking of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because really doing this well is about having great culture. And I think we would all agree that a culture where people can bring their whole selves to work, where we are curious about people's different perspectives, where we don't just surround ourselves with people who studied in the same schools we did, studied the same subjects, have the same opinions, do the same things outside of work, but actually we're curious about different lived experiences, different perspectives, and we kind of run towards those different perspectives to say, well, what am I missing? What would you see, and how would you see this problem if you were looking at it from that perspective or that one? For me, that's a rich culture, and a culture that should withstand the test of time and challenges, rather than being, I think, reasonably fragile if it's only designed in a particular mold. But let's remember, culture is how everyone behaves when no one's looking, right? That's really culture. We talk a lot about culture being set from the top, and I've been the CEO, and I don't think I set the culture. Culture is how everyone behaves, so it's all about what you tolerate and what you stand for and what you accept. And so culture is about what is and isn't celebrated and encouraged, and that is led from the top. If as a leader, you're willing to make mistakes, if as a leader, you're curious about the perspectives you don't know, you acknowledge that you don't know everything, and you invite challenge and perspectives that are different to yours, you help facilitate a culture where that can happen.
So Carol, is this really kind of the center of what we're talking about when we talk about diversity and inclusion, that sort of who owns that culture? I mean, as Mitesh said, the CEO can make a statement, but the culture is what happens when the CEO is not in the room. What is that really the center of what we're talking about?
In many ways, yes, absolutely, because you don't get change by hiring one person that you then think will tick the box and get you off the hook in terms of governance, because that doesn't then change the culture. Like, you don't bring in one woman into a company and then say, look, sorted. It's going to take 3 or more to make a difference. And the same with bringing in LGBTQ or bringing in minorities or bringing different abilities in, that you're going to have to kind of stack it a bit if you want to get that cultural change where, whether the CEO's in the room or out of the room, it's going to be a constant, you know. And it's really important to have the group think that comes with it, and the robust discussion, and be willing to listen to other people who don't necessarily share your viewpoint and haven't had the same exact education that you have had and the same upbringing and the same neighborhood, that they're going to bring in other perspectives, and you're going to disagree, and you have to be civil. You have to already have that set in place, that it's okay that we don't disagree, because we're actually going to get better results from this. We're going to come up with newer ideas, and they're going to be more resilient when you start poking at them from all the different angles, which, you know, leads to, you know, better risk management as well.
I'm going to stay with you. We spoke about something before, which I thought was interesting, which is this idea of a safe space in the organization, but a safe space for everyone to have this conversation. And I'm going to stick with your lunchbox analogy because I thought it was very good, but it's kind of this, how do you create that safe space that lets everyone around the table feel safe, that they can say, oh, what is that? Can you tell me? Can you tell me what that food is? Can you share that with me? How important is that, and how do you create that?
Safe space is huge, but you have to think about how is it that you construct it honestly and really, because you can say, this space is now safe, but it changes nothing. And I think that it starts from, what you have to have in place is a culture of kindness and the desire to help each other and to flourish, for all the humans in the company to flourish. So then you have that safer environment, because you know you're not going to get attacked, because that just doesn't happen there, right? So then when you have these safe spaces, you can say, okay, you can tell me about these experiences. You don't have to, you know, but I would gain from knowing more about what it is that led to this perspective, like what kind of, you know, traumatic childhood experience you had, you know, living in a certain neighborhood, being a certain race, and how this has influenced your views, and what you know about these markets, and what you know about all of these influences. But no one should feel like they have to do that too. That's also a part of it, that you can willingly go into this space, or you can, you know, also protect yourself, but that you will always be greeted with kindness and compassion if you choose to do that.
What do you think, Mitesh? How do you create a safe space?
I totally agree with what Carol said so far. I think for me, I'd add to it to say safety, really, the spaces between your ears, it's in your head as a human being, that we know whether we're in fight or flight, or whether we're safe, right? We make that judgment every day, every second, in every room we walk into, in every conversation we're part of. And so the purpose of the work environment, if it really wants to engage us with our rational, our creative brain, rather than just relying on our kind of judgments and instincts and kind of systems one primitive thinking, is to make us feel safe, to make us feel, and what is that? It's the safety to be able to speak up without worrying about the repercussions. It's the safety to be able to ask stupid questions. It's the safety to be curious and learn and question and challenge a running train to say, I don't think this is a great idea, and it doesn't matter how much money we've put behind it. Or to be able to challenge authority, one of the hardest things in our cultures. And yet, there's books and books and papers written about how important it is for the stability of our systems and processes and everything else to challenge authority. As human beings, we're not wired to do that. So you have to over-communicate that it is not only safe, it is encouraged. You are expected to be able to do that. And that doesn't just happen once. You've got to do it again and again and again in order to be able to make it a habit.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're describing sounds wonderful, but it's, at the end of the day, it's a company, it's a department that has to find a strategy to make these things happen. So I'll start with Mitesh, and then I'll go to you, Carol. First I want to know the successes, and then I want to hear some failures. So Mitesh, what are some of the strategies you've seen work?
So yeah, I've been a big fan of this, which is let's actually do some stuff rather than sit around talking about it. So one of the most valuable things, really simple, that had a big impact for me was just getting people up on stage or virtually every quarter to talk about their lived experiences. What is it about you? The question would basically be, what is it about you that I don't know or can't see, but if I understood, I'd be able to work with you better. Mm-hmm. And we would just ask people to share in 10 minutes elements of their childhood, their background, their stories, on a voluntary basis. No one was forced. And everybody in the firm would turn up because everyone's a bit nosy, right? And everyone loves great storytelling. And it was fascinating. And people would get together afterwards and say, I had no idea that that's the story of your life, or your background, or your perspective. Or I totally get why you do what you do now because of this perspective. It was just a really simple way to be able to increase the empathy in the organization and help people understand experiences that weren't their own lived ones. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd point to would be recognizing how important line managers are. I mean, really, we don't work for an organization, we work for our line manager. Most of the time when we leave an organization, we're leaving the manager, not the organization. And so I would get together every quarter with everybody who managed anybody in the firm, virtually, where we couldn't all fit in a room, to really try and set the terms of, well, this is a great privilege we've given you to manage people. It is through you that we are retaining, developing, leveraging the talent in this organization. That's a real privilege. And so what do we expect from you? And we asked the employees to rate their managers on how well they were doing against the commitments that we had made as managers. And what was fascinating was managers wanted to learn from each other. So they wanted to know who's doing really well in holding their people accountable, or who's doing really well in being able to help people in their times of need. And they didn't want external trainers. They wanted to learn from their peers. So we created a mechanism by which we could create commitments, we could get feedback, and we could learn from each other.
Was the feedback anonymous?
It was anonymous. And that touched every employee in the firm. So a really powerful way to create an inclusive culture.
Okay, I'll stay with you for a bit then, because I want to know the other side of the coin. In terms of trying to create that diverse workforce and retain them, what have you seen fail?
Lots of stuff. I think Carol started to talk about it.
I know. She's like dying.
add one woman on the board and think you're done, or bring in one person of color into your executive team and go, right, we're good. So that kind of tokenism, I've never seen work. Just starting at the board and at the top, I've not seen work. Again, as I say, I think it's that line management layer. That's where the magic happens. That's also where the toxicity happens. That's the layer to focus on. Other things that I've seen, not work is just, a lot of talk and a lot of time spending kind of in fear about kind of what to do in this space. So for me, we have not as a society ever really done this successfully. So we're going to have to accept that we're going into a new phase and we have to unlearn and relearn things as human beings and as groups. That means we're going to have to take risk. And so to do it in a riskless way, I don't see working.
Interesting. Yeah. So Carol, I'm going to give it to you. And I want successes and failures, so I'm leaving it up to you what you want to start with.
What shall I start with? What I like for successes, I think a good example of that is the fund where I am, Kavedon, has a behavioral science division. And it's people that are just trained in psychology that are really devoted to understanding the needs of founders and what they're going through psychologically. Because, our bread and butter are founders, right? And if they are struggling And the thing about founders is that there's, a higher incidence of like different kinds of mental health struggles, substance abuse, bipolarism, and, like I said, compassion. You need that, and you need to work to understand that there, maybe the neurodiversity in founder pools, right? And I really appreciated that approach that they have, and also being diversity focused from the beginning, starting off with LGBTQ, a lot of women, a lot of minorities from the get-go, that then just sort of, there's no mandate, they just sort of breathe it. And that you can tell from, the founders they find from it. It's just to be, to use the verb to be in that case. So I think that works. For failures, I don't like to harp on failures, but I like to learn from them. I can think of an instance where something had occurred in the greater world, a happening that was very unfortunate in the Black American neighborhoods in the U.S. And there was sort of an expectation, not at my fund where I am now, there was an expectation that we would open up and share our raw experiences to teach everyone else in the fund what it was like to be Black American, what it was like to come from one of these neighborhoods. And, we were traumatized and trying to process what was going on in the news, what we were seeing, and the expectation that then we were supposed to just suddenly turn into these teachers and explain life experience to people who then would just watch and take it in. That did not work well. And I think that's one thing, is to don't expect your team to teach you what it's like to be them if they're not open to it at the moment. You have to let them process, and that's not really their role. If they want to share it, great. And it should be, like from a friend-to-friend basis, but not where they feel like there's an expectation for it and that they will be judged for it, for sharing their diverse experiences with you. And that I've seen as a startling no-go.
Can I add a couple of other things? The one tip I would give everyone in the room and everyone listening would be, when you're writing job applications or job descriptions for hiring someone, really ask yourself if you need the person to have had experience in the role before. And number two, the big enemy of diverse hiring is to hit the ground running, right? What does that really mean when you unpack it? It's that we need someone who can hit the ground running, who's a cultural fit, who won't cause any friction, who's done exactly what we need somewhere else, and we can slot in perfectly. That is the enemy of diversity. So don't say you're looking to hire diversely and then look for tons of experience doing exactly the same thing and hit the ground running. So the antithesis of that is, if you really want to make a better, more resilient culture that's going to succeed and innovate, then plan ahead and think about the skills and perspectives and talents that you don't have in the organization, but that you'll need to win in the future, and hire in advance of that, and recognize that you might have to teach some of the things you take for granted, some of the sharp edges you might have to work with, and but it's much easier to teach someone how to present well, or how to hold their, when they're presented with 3 lots of forks and knives, what to do with that. Much easier to teach than the stuff that's really going to make the difference that you're hiring for.
Can I add to that?
Go for it.
Because we were just talking about that outside. And, I work with founders. And I like when they come up to me knowing that if they feel that I'm safe, to come up to unpolished, right, with their deck, still a wreck, but they've got a great idea, they've got a great brain, they've got everything it takes to do it, but they just haven't been privy to this kind of information before. And there's an example, there's a fantastic, female founder that came up to me, and she just had no idea about how much she should ask for. And, and who else was she going to ask?
Yeah.
Right? And so I like that I project the image of someone that you can just come ask. I won't judge you for it, right? I actually benefit from it, from knowing you early stage. And like I can, a couple of days workshop will get them up and ready to present and good to go, right? But you can't, I would rather have the substance and then the polish later, or with no polish, than to have the polish with no substance.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've had that myself with the VC world and startups is very male dominated. When you're the only woman on stage, you get a line of women founders because they want to talk to you. It was interesting. Everything I've taken from our conversation is really about this empathy and being open to listening and having this conversation. And a few months, even when you think about diversity, I think sometimes your head does go into 50-50 gender parity, or and of course, as you mentioned, just having a black woman on your board, is not a successful D&I program. But something happened to me a few months ago on a panel, and we had someone on who was on the spectrum, and he spoke about how, and especially this is true with the pandemic, open planned offices, hot desking, not being able to have the same desk every day in the same place was stopping him from working. And I remember listening to this thinking, I would never have realized that. That would never enter my mind, that not having your desk in the same place every day would actually hurt someone who's coming from a different experience than I have. So I guess we only have about 5 minutes left, but how do you share those stories? How do we share our learnings so that we make the world and the industry a better place? What do you think?
I think it goes back to safety and feeling like you can share these stories and that people really want to hear them. And if you create this kind of culture, organizationally, like people outside come to you and want to tell you things. And people inside want to tell you things, and then you also want to tell everybody something. And so the stories start flowing, and the information starts flowing, and then we all start learning and growing together. Again, you can't expect or force anybody to, but I think that if you make yourself kind of the kind of person someone wants to tell a story to, you will start to get those stories.
Interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, just to back up for a minute on that point, for me, the reality is most of us are shaped by our narrow lived experiences. So you're absolutely right. Why would we know? And all of us have some level of bias within us. We may be a person of color and still have racist perspectives or sexist perspectives or bias of some kind, depending on our specific lived experience. And the only way you can change that is by exposing yourself to people who have different lived experiences. And that doesn't just have to be at work, right? There's sometimes too much burden we put on work to say that's where everything needs to happen. That's going to make me a better human being, right? The reality is, let's first acknowledge, and I get a little worried by, we talked about safety earlier, politicizing diversity and inclusion in the workspace, because there's nothing worse in a professional environment today than being called a sexist or racist, right? That's pretty career terminal, I'd say. But what does that mean? That means someone's going to fear speaking up or being curious. So the safety goes at both ends of the spectrum. We need everyone to be able to say, I don't know this. Can you tell me? And not make assumptions, right? So the age-old, assuming makes an ass out of you and me, I think really applies here because, again, when I was, as I run my team today, one of the first things that I did was I spoke to the female fund managers and said, we want to encourage more female fund managers. What am I missing? What are the obstacles that are in the way? And I have some idea of that. I've worked with plenty of female fund managers and invested and backed them. But I've learned not to assume, and I've learned to ask. And if that's all we could do, that's a really easy step forward from where we are today.
Excellent. So I think we're going to have to continue this open conversation during the coffee break. So lovely. I want to thank Carol and Mitesh. Thank you very much.